5%. That was the yield flashing in cold red on Wall Street's glowing tickers. 5% on U.S. Treasuries, once the safe harbor of global finance, now a warning flare of panic. Investors weren't buying the promise of stability anymore. They were fleeing, rushing for the exits as if the very foundation of American dominance was collapsing beneath their feet. And at that very moment, Washington pulled the trigger on a move so audacious it stunned the world, blocking TSMC and Samsung, the two giants responsible for the silicon lifeblood of modern civilization. The images told the story. On trading floors from New York to London, brokers clutched their heads, screens bleeding red, whispers turning to shouts. Half a world away, in the industrial heartlands of Taiwan and South Korea, factory floors slowed to a crawl. Workers stared at silent conveyor belts once meant to feed smartphones, cars, medical devices, and fighter jets. The hum of progress quieted, and in its place rose the chilling sound of uncertainty. The message from Washington was clear: control the chips, control the future. But the consequences were darker than even its architects had imagined. This wasn't just about semiconductors, it was about trust, the invisible currency that bound nations to America's financial system. And with yield spiking, that trust was evaporating. To ordinary citizens, the story was almost surreal. Phones in hand, they scrolled through headlines that sounded like science fiction: U.S. freezes chip arteries. Investors dump treasuries. Global markets in shock. Parents worried about jobs tied to electronics, students asked if their laptops would soon be relics, and pensioners wondered if their savings would survive another crash. The panic was global, but its roots were American hubris, the belief that cutting others off would keep Washington strong. Yet in that moment, what looked like strength revealed itself as desperation. And while the White House congratulated itself on a bold show of control, a far more dangerous truth loomed unseen. Because what America thought was control, was about to spiral out of its hands. Chips are the silent pulse of the modern age. Invisible to the naked eye, smaller than a fingernail, they carry the weight of an entire civilization. Every smartphone tap, every electric car ignition, every jet fighter streaking across the sky relies on them. From the hospital MRI to the satellite guiding a farmer's crops, the chip is everywhere, and without it, progress halts. This is why TSMC and Samsung became more than companies. They became guardians of the world's lifeblood. Taiwan's TSMC, etched in the precision of nanometers, and South Korea's Samsung, with its sprawling technological empire, together command more than 2/3 of global semiconductor production. Without them, the digital world doesn't just stumble, it collapses. Washington knew this. That knowledge was its weapon. The belief inside the halls of power was simple, even arrogant: choke the chips, and you choke the future. No rival, no adversary, no partner could move without America's permission if these lifelines were controlled. It wasn't just about keeping a technological edge, it was about holding the entire world economy in a fist. But such a gamble ignored the fragility of interdependence. Factories in Stuttgart waiting for microcontrollers. Assembly lines in Detroit halting because dashboards lacked processors. Aerospace firms in Toulouse grounded because avionics shipments stopped. Even defense systems, iron domes, missile guidance, cyber shields, are as strong as the semiconductors that power them. When Washington pressed down on TSMC and Samsung, it wasn't just strangling Asia. It was tightening a noose around everyone, including itself. Investors recognized the danger instantly. They understood that semiconductors are not a sector, they are the skeleton of global trade. A world without chips is a world without motion, without growth. So when Washington chose to wield chips as weapons, confidence cracked. The red glow on Wall Street wasn't only about numbers, it was about a dawning fear: if semiconductors fall, the world economy follows. And that fear spread fast. Social media filled with frantic posts, tech enthusiasts warning of shortages, auto workers fearing layoffs, analysts whispering that the supply chain could collapse in weeks. It wasn't paranoia, it was prophecy. Because unlike oil, which can be drilled in many places, or grain, which can be grown anew, advanced chips have only two masters. To strike them was to strike the very heart of the 21st century. Washington thought this would cement its dominance. Instead, it lit the fuse of uncertainty. Allies felt the tremor. Rivals prepared to exploit the chaos. Neutral nations asked whether tying themselves to America's vision was still safe. And in that crack of doubt, a new alignment began to form. What happened next would redraw global markets. To understand the chaos flashing across Wall Street screens, you have to look back at the habits of power that brought America here. Washington had long wielded its dominance not with quiet partnership, but with arrogance, turning tools of cooperation into weapons of control. Sanctions became the blunt instrument of choice. One signature from the Oval Office could sever nations from banking systems, freeze billions in reserves, or block companies from global trade. For decades, this worked. The world played by American rules because the penalties for disobedience were too great. The dollar was the crown jewel of this empire. As the global reserve currency, it gave Washington the ability to print what others had to earn, to borrow while others begged, to punish while others pleaded. Every transaction that crossed oceans, oil sales, chip shipments, even food trade, passed through a system where U.S. regulators had the final word. This wasn't just economic power. It was political leverage disguised as finance. Allies were reminded often, in subtle and not-so-subtle ways, that their prosperity depended on access to America's financial bloodstream. Technology was the second pillar of control. American companies sat atop the digital hierarchy: chip designers, software firms, cloud platforms. To most of the world, these seemed like symbols of progress. But to Washington, they became leverage points. When disagreements arose, licenses were pulled. When rivals grew bold, exports were banned. When partners hesitated, this pattern bred arrogance. In the case of Asia's chip titans, Washington assumed dependence was eternal. The thinking was clear: Taiwan and South Korea might manufacture the chips, but they still needed Wall Street's financing, American software tools, and U.S. markets. "They can't survive without us," was the quiet refrain in the corridors of power. Policymakers painted scenarios where America's grip was unbreakable, where any attempt to resist would collapse under the weight of lost capital and closed doors. It was the illusion of invincibility, the same illusion that had lulled other empires before into decline. Washington strutted like a blind Goliath, convinced that its size alone was enough to intimidate. Allies were pressured to fall in line, told that siding with America was not just smart but inevitable. Those who hesitated were threatened with exclusion. Even close partners learned the sting of conditional loyalty: one misstep on trade with China, one refusal to sanction a rival, and Washington's wrath would fall. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Each sanction pushed nations to search for alternatives. Each tech ban inspired engineers to innovate beyond American reach. Each financial punishment encouraged countries to ask whether tying their future to the dollar was still safe. What Washington dismissed as noise was, in reality, the quiet prelude to a new world being built brick by brick. And so when the decision came to block TSMC and Samsung, it was not a show of strength. It was the desperate flex of an empire trying to remind the world of its power. It was arrogance distilled into policy. Yet in its triumphalism, Washington failed to see the danger of overreach. For when a giant swings blindly, it does not just strike its enemies, it wounds itself. Investors, allies, and rivals all watched the move with the same thought: could America truly choke the world's lifeblood without consequences? In betting on control, Washington revealed fear. In trying to prove its dominance, it exposed vulnerability. Because the truth was simple. Asia was no longer the dependent child of Washington's system. Far from Wall Street, in the laboratories of Hsinchu and Suwon, engineers were already building a different future. Long before their names carried the weight of nations, TSMC and Samsung were small firms fighting for survival. In the 1980s, Taiwan was still seen as a manufacturing hub for low-cost goods, and South Korea was better known for shipbuilding and textiles than high technology. Yet in boardrooms and government offices, a vision was forming: to leapfrog into the future by mastering the most unforgiving industry of all, semiconductors. For Taiwan, it was the birth of the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, under the leadership of Morris Chang. It wasn't just a company, it was a national mission. Taiwan invested heavily in education, research parks, and infrastructure. Engineers worked long nights under fluorescent lights, poring over microscopes and etching circuits invisible to the naked eye. They sacrificed weekends, birthdays, even health, driven by the belief that their small island could become the beating heart of global technology. In South Korea, Samsung walked a similar path, though forged in the fires of competition. The Lee family empire pushed relentlessly into new industries, never satisfied with mediocrity. At first, the world dismissed their efforts. Too small, critics scoffed. Too late. Yet one by one, Samsung silenced doubters. From memory chips to advanced processors, their factories roared to life with a discipline that bordered on obsession. Workers took pride in precision. A single defective chip was treated not as a mistake, but as a shame to be corrected. What united these two giants was sacrifice. Unlike the sprawling arrogance of Washington's financial empires, TSMC and Samsung built their dominance brick by brick, wafer by wafer. Engineers slept on office floors. Governments funneled scarce resources into labs instead of luxury. Families accepted the strain of fathers and mothers working endless hours in clean rooms. It was the underdog's journey, the humility to sweat for progress, the discipline to outlast doubt. By the dawn of the 21st century, their perseverance bore fruit. TSMC had become the world's leading contract chipmaker, producing designs for companies from Apple to Nvidia. Samsung rose as the memory king, its semiconductors powering phones, servers, and supercomputers. Together, these two companies were no longer just firms. They were pillars holding up the digital age. Every smartphone beep, every car engine click, every missile launch carried the imprint of their labor. Their rise symbolized more than technological prowess, it was the triumph of nations once dismissed as small players. Taiwan and South Korea, caught between empires, had carved identities not through conquest or domination, but through discipline and ingenuity. They became proof that greatness was not reserved for giants, that dignity could be built from persistence. Yet for all their success, they remained vulnerable. America still controlled the financial system. Washington still believed it could dictate terms. When policymakers looked east, they saw factories dependent on U.S. tools, markets, and capital. They assumed TSMC and Samsung would always remain obedient, chained by necessity. That was the arrogance, the blindness of a Goliath unable to imagine the resilience of its so-called dependence. Inside the clean rooms of Hsinchu and Suwon, however, the story was different. Engineers weren't just producing chips, they were innovating beyond Washington's reach. They developed advanced nodes at 3 and even 2 nanometers, far ahead of U.S. fabrication capabilities. They built alliances across Asia, securing supply chains in chemicals, rare earths, and equipment. Quietly, they diversified financing away from Wall Street, leaning on sovereign funds and regional banks. The chains America believed unbreakable were already being loosened, link by link. The sacrifice never stopped. Stories emerged of young engineers collapsing from exhaustion, of managers sleeping under their desks during product launches, of entire teams working through typhoons to keep fabs operational. These were not the actions of corporations chasing profit alone. They were acts of national service. For Taiwan, TSMC was a shield against isolation. For South Korea, Samsung was the symbol of rebirth after war. Each chip produced was not just silicon, it was sovereignty. And so, when Washington decided to block them, it miscalculated gravely. It saw factories and numbers. It failed to see the spirit behind them, the decades of struggle, the generations of and when Washington tried to block them, the world gasped at their answer. The announcement of Washington's blockade sent shockwaves across the globe. Within hours, Asian capitals voiced their outrage. In Taipei, leaders condemned the move as an assault not just on Taiwan's economy, but on the global supply chain itself. In Seoul, officials spoke with carefully measured words, but their meaning was unmistakable. The United States had crossed a line between partnership and sabotage. In Europe, the response was less fiery but no less troubled. Leaders in Berlin, Paris, and Brussels watched nervously as markets convulsed. Automakers in Germany, electronics firms in France, and telecom companies across the continent all depended on chips from TSMC and Samsung. Suddenly, their supply lines looked fragile, hanging by a thread of geopolitics. European diplomats whispered unease, asking if Washington had just endangered their industries for the sake of a power play. And on Wall Street, the panic was impossible to ignore. Investors dumped treasuries, fearing that a financial system already fragile could not absorb the shock of collapsing semiconductor supply. Screens lit up in red, traders barked frantic orders, and analysts wondered if this was the beginning of a downturn that no bailout could soften. Yet in Washington, the refrain was familiar, almost rehearsed. "This is about national security," officials declared. "We cannot allow adversaries to exploit our dependence on foreign technology." The words were firm, the tone defiant. To policymakers, this was a righteous stand. To much of the world, it looked like desperation disguised as strength. The contrast in tone was striking. American voices grew louder, harsher, dripping with urgency. Officials threatened allies who dared question the blockade, warning of consequences for any nation that broke ranks. It was fury wrapped in patriotism, anger laced with fear. Across Asia, however, the response was calm. Leaders in Taipei and Seoul did not shout. They did not threaten. Instead, they spoke with measured dignity, their composure amplifying the chaos unraveling in Washington. They reminded the world that chips were not weapons but necessities, that strangling supply would only deepen instability. Their restraint was their strength, and the more composed they appeared, the more frantic Washington seemed. For citizens watching on both sides of the Pacific, the optics were undeniable. America looked like an empire rattled, shouting to maintain its grip. Asia looked like the steady hand, the grown-up in the room, reminding everyone what was truly at stake: stability, progress, and trust. Diplomatic debates flared in the United Nations, in the G20, in closed-door summits. Allies squirmed, rivals smiled, and neutrals weighed their options. Could the world afford to tie itself to Washington if this was how it wielded power? Was this the beginning of a broader unraveling? The clash wasn't only about chips anymore. It was about credibility. And Washington's was slipping with every angry press conference, every panicked market reaction, every new threat against those who dared dissent. Then came the moment that shattered the illusion of control. It began quietly, almost too quietly for Washington to notice. While U.S. officials filled podiums with talk of national security and sanctions, in Asia, boardrooms were buzzing with a different energy. In Taipei and Seoul, leaders of TSMC and Samsung gathered with government ministers and financiers. Behind closed doors, strategies long prepared in silence were set in motion. And then, in one synchronized moment, the world heard their answer. Press conferences were held simultaneously in Taipei and Seoul. The words were calm, but the meaning was explosive. "We will not be strangled," the TSMC spokesperson declared. "We will not allow one nation to dictate the future of global technology." Samsung's chairman, equally composed, announced that new frameworks had been signed, multi-billion-dollar partnerships with Chinese firms, oil-rich Gulf states, and sovereign wealth funds spanning from Abu Dhabi to Riyadh. The mic drop was in the details. No dollars. Not a single one. Instead, deals would be financed through local currencies, the yuan, the won, even the dinar. Payments would bypass Wall Street entirely, flowing through regional banks and digital settlement systems America could not touch. Sovereign funds that once parked their wealth in U.S. Treasuries would now underwrite fabs in Asia and Middle Eastern data centers. What Washington thought was leverage, the dollar, was being sidestepped like an outdated gatekeeper. The drama was technical yet theatrical. Slides flashed across giant screens, showing charts of chip supply chains rerouted through Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Dubai. Engineers explained that production would continue uninterrupted, now backed by financing channels America could not freeze. Economists detailed how sovereign funds had already committed tens of billions, ensuring factories stayed alive and innovation continued. And then came the killer blow. A partnership between TSMC, Samsung, and Chinese giants promised to co-develop next-generation chips at 2 nanometers and beyond. "Innovation cannot be sanctioned," the speaker declared, pausing just long enough for the words to sting. The room erupted in applause, cameras flashed, and across the world, investors realized something staggering: the chokehold was broken. Markets imploded almost instantly. On Wall Street, the 5% yield on Treasuries, already flashing red, spiked higher as investors dumped U.S. bonds in a panic. Billions fled into Asian markets, gold, and cryptocurrencies. Traders shouted into phones, analysts stammered on live television, and anchors struggled to explain how America's bold move had backfired in spectacular fashion. "This isn't just about chips," one analyst whispered on air, sweat beading on his forehead. "This is about the end of the dollar's monopoly." In Washington, the mood shifted from defiance to disbelief. Trump's successors, flanked by grim-faced advisors, stared at screens showing collapsing bond prices and jubilant crowds in Asia. They had expected fear, submission, a desperate plea for mercy. Instead, they were watching triumph. And triumph was exactly what it was. For citizens across Taiwan and South Korea, the announcements were a validation of decades of sacrifice. Workers in cleanrooms, engineers who had labored through nights and storms, families who had endured the pressures of building industries from scratch, they saw their resilience honored on the world stage. Social media in Asia exploded with messages of pride, videos of engineers clapping in factories, students cheering in classrooms, hashtags celebrating independence. In the Middle East, leaders praised the deals as the dawn of a new era. State media in Riyadh broadcast jubilant commentaries about how Gulf oil wealth would now fuel not just energy, but the digital future. In Beijing, headlines declared a historic step toward technological sovereignty. And in Europe, where industries had feared the collapse of supply chains, relief mixed with unease, relief that chips would keep flowing, unease that America had been bypassed so effortlessly. The mic drop moment came at the close of the announcements. A joint statement from TSMC and Samsung, echoed by their government backers, declared, "America's attempt to control chips has unleashed chaos it cannot contain. We choose cooperation over coercion, innovation over intimidation, sovereignty over submission." The words reverberated like a hammer strike. On social feeds, clips of the declaration went viral, edited into cinematic montages with music swelling in the background. On TikTok, young creators paired the phrase with images of crumbling US dollar bills, replaced by glowing yuan and won symbols. Memes flooded Instagram, mocking Washington's arrogance with captions like, "When you try to choke the world but end up choking yourself." By nightfall in the US, the panic deepened. Lawmakers bickered on Capitol Hill, accusing each other of handing Asia the upper hand. Financial commentators warned that allies might soon consider their own alternatives to the dollar, fearing that Washington's sanctions-first strategy had finally gone too far. The dollar index wavered, oil futures shifted, and whispers of a post-dollar world no longer sounded like conspiracy, but like inevitability. Meanwhile, in Asia, the mood was electric. In Taipei, thousands gathered outside TSMC's headquarters waving flags and chanting slogans about sovereignty and innovation. In Seoul, Samsung's campus lit up in blue and white, projecting triumphant messages across skyscrapers. The energy was not just corporate, it was national. A collective pride surged across nations long told they were dependent, proving instead that they could stand on their own. And all the while, Washington scrambled to regain footing. Officials threatened further sanctions, floated emergency measures, and even considered pressuring European allies to condemn the moves. But the damage was already done. America's attempt to tighten its grip had slipped, and the world had watched it lose balance. The spectacle was global, the symbolism undeniable. The giant had swung its fist, and hit only air. By dawn, hashtags lit up across the globe. By the time the sun rose, the internet had already written its verdict. Hashtags swept across platforms like wildfire, hashtag chip wars, hashtag bye-bye dollar, hashtag Silicon Revolt. Memes compared Washington to a gambler who bet everything and lost. One viral clip looped the TSMC and Samsung declaration with the caption, "Innovation cannot be sanctioned." Set to thunderous music, it pulled millions of views in hours. TikTok teens edited Wall Street's red screens into cinematic montages of collapse, while Twitter/X threads brimmed with disbelief and dark humor. For many in Asia and the Middle East, this wasn't just business news. It was vindication. Decades of feeling cornered by US dominance had finally been flipped into a story of defiance and triumph. Ordinary people posted photos of their smartphones and laptops with captions like, "Built by us, not controlled by them." It became a digital celebration of sovereignty. Western media, however, was divided. Some outlets dismissed the announcements as political theater, accusing Beijing, Seoul, and Taipei of staging a show to rattle investors. Editorials called it propaganda designed to scare markets and predicted Washington would quickly reassert control. But others broke ranks, calling it what it was, a turning point. One respected European analyst said on live television, "This may be remembered as the moment the dollar's inevitability was questioned for the first time in a century." Allies, too, felt the tremor. In Europe, whispers grew in diplomatic corridors. Could the EU trust Washington's judgment when its decisions risked collapsing industries overnight? In Germany, automakers lobbied for neutrality, desperate to keep chip supplies flowing. French newspapers asked whether Europe's future lay with a multipolar order rather than clinging to America's fading monopoly. Japan, Washington's closest Asian ally, faced its own quiet reckoning. Tokyo publicly reaffirmed its commitment to the US, but behind closed doors, officials debated whether hedging was now inevitable. If the world's two chip titans could slip Washington's leash, what stopped others from doing the same? NATO, too, was unsettled. Its purpose was military, but members understood that economic markets continued their spiral. Treasury yields stayed high, currencies in Asia firmed, and capital inflows shifted eastward. Wall Street analysts, once smug about America's unassailable role, appeared on screens pale and stammering, trying to calm investors while sounding unconvinced themselves. For ordinary Americans, the story trickled in as a mix of confusion and dread. News anchors spoke of chip shortages, market turmoil, and allies wavering. People asked what it meant for their cars, their jobs, their savings. Few understood the technicalities of sovereign funds or yuan settlements, but everyone understood the sinking feeling that America's grip was slipping. The symbolism was undeniable. The empire of the dollar had been dented not by bombs or battleships, but by microchips, the very building blocks of modern life. A quiet revolution had erupted in the space of a single announcement, and Washington looked less like a leader and more like a desperate power watching its influence bleed away. But the real loss wasn't chips, it was America's credibility. When the dust of the announcements began to settle, the world was left with more than contracts and currency shifts. What emerged was a story about power, and what truly sustains it. Washington had believed that dominance came from the ability to control, to dictate, to sanction. For decades, that belief seemed unshakable. Yet the events surrounding TSMC and Samsung revealed something deeper, that the future doesn't bend to arrogance, it bends to cooperation. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. On one side stood America, swinging sanctions like weapons, convinced that others had no choice but to obey. On the other stood Asia's chipmakers, calm yet determined, choosing dignity over submission. It was the clash of two philosophies, control versus humility, intimidation versus resilience. And the